It was the year 1886, in a high basin where the wind was not a force of nature, but a predator. The old-timers had already branded it a killer winter before the first snowflake had even fallen. All the omens were present. The elk sported coats of double thickness, the tree bark was drawn tight against the wood, and a profound silence settled over the valley, weighing down on the settlement's rooftops. In response to this looming threat, most of the town's men descended into a state of frantic preparation. They were clear-cutting the nearby forests, erecting walls of firewood so tall they cast shadows over the pale winter sun. Their strategy was to combat the cold with overwhelming force, under the belief that survival was a simple equation of how much fuel one could incinerate. Yet, one young man named Andrew was engaged in a different activity entirely. He was not a hero, nor was he a man of influence. He was the sort of quiet individual who went unnoticed until he mended something you hadn't realized was broken. While his peers were busy sharpening their axes and toppling ancient pines, Andrew could be found down at the frozen creek, breaking through the ice to haul up pails of dense, gray clay. He was also dragging basalt stones, unattractive, cumbersome rocks that everyone else ignored, into the confines of his small, drafty cabin. His neighbors observed him from their porches, leaning against their axes as their breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and they chuckled. They nicknamed him the Mud Dauber. They jested about his plan to hurl rocks at the impending blizzard. They perceived a boy squandering vital energy on a mound of earth. What they failed to grasp was that they were witnessing the construction of a survival machine. This is not a tale of enchantment or of good fortune. It is a narrative about the distinction between opposing nature and comprehending the laws of physics. The men with the axes were engaged in a war of attrition they were fated to lose. Their entire strategy depended on combustion, burning wood at a furious pace to warm the air, which would then instantly leak through the gaps in their log walls. They were, in essence, attempting to heat the entire sky. Andrew, however, was assembling a battery. His interest was not in creating fire, but in capturing its essence. He understood a fundamental concept the others had overlooked. Heat behaves like a fluid, and much like water, it can be contained if one constructs the proper vessel. What the townspeople dismissed as a heap of mud and rock was, in fact, an advanced thermal mass capacitor, engineered to absorb the violent energy of a fire and then release it slowly, almost gently, over many hours. They paid him no mind, leaving him to his work in the mud and quiet. But 3 weeks later, when the mercury in the thermometers froze and shattered at 30 degrees below zero, and the wind chill leached the warmth from every other dwelling in the valley, the laughter ceased. Because while his neighbors were jolted awake every 2 hours to feed their insatiable iron stoves, trembling beneath layers of fur, Andrew was sleeping soundly in a t-shirt. His cabin was not merely enduring, it was maintaining a steady 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and he was achieving this with a small bundle of twigs that would have been insufficient to boil a kettle of coffee in an ordinary stove. This is the account of the physics they chose to disregard. The true emergency unfolding in the settlement was not the plummeting temperature, it was the ever-expanding radius of devastation. By the middle of November, the town had effectively consumed the forests that encircled it. The wood famine became a palpable, frightening reality. The easily accessible timber, the deadfall, and the nearby pine groves had been exhausted weeks prior. Now, the men were rising at 4 a.m, hitching their shivering horse teams, and pulling sleds for 5 or 6 miles through deep snow just to locate standing deadwood. It was a caloric deficit that could not be reconciled. They were expending more energy to gather the fuel than the fuel itself could provide in warmth. And the true tragedy, the stark, mathematical tragedy, was that they were squandering that precious energy. They were shackled to the open hearth and the cast-iron box stove. To the untrained observer, a blazing fireplace evokes a sense of comfort and security. But to a physicist, an open fireplace represents an energetic catastrophe. It functions as a pump, specifically designed to expel heat from a structure. When you ignite a large fire, you create a high-velocity plume of rising hot air. That heat, earned through the labor of chopping and hauling, shoots directly up the chimney to warm the clouds above. In a typical open hearth, a staggering 90% of the thermal energy is lost to the atmosphere. You are not warming your home, you are venting your chances of survival. But the situation was even worse. This is where the draft paradox enters the picture, a principle the freezing neighbors could not comprehend because it contradicted their intuition. Fire breathes. It demands enormous quantities of oxygen to maintain its roar. A substantial open fire can inhale hundreds of cubic feet of air each minute. That air must be sourced from somewhere. It is drawn from the room itself. As the room is depleted of air, the pressure drops, generating a vacuum that requires filling. Consequently, the house begins to inhale. It sucks in frigid air through the crevices beneath the door, the gaps around window frames, and the chinking between the log walls. The more intensely you burn the fire, the more powerful a draft you generate. You are literally vacuuming sub-zero winter air into your living space to feed the beast in your hearth. This explains the familiar, wretched sensation the settlers experienced. Their faces would be scorching hot, almost blistering from the fire's radiant light, while their backs were chilled by a draft of -30-degree air rushing in to replace what the fire had consumed. They were ensnared in a cycle of diminishing returns, fueling a system that cooled the room more effectively the harder it worked. From his window, Andrew observed this mounting panic. He could see the desperation in the increasingly frantic movements of the sleds each day. But he did not enter the race. He was responding to the physics of the situation, not the weather. While the town was fixated on generation, producing heat in the immediate moment, Andrew was obsessed with retention. He had noticed something simple during the autumn, something that required patience to perceive. He had watched the large basalt boulders on the south-facing ridge. After the sun dipped below the horizon and the air temperature plunged, the rocks stayed warm. Hours after sunset, one could still press a hand against the gray stone and feel the lingering pulse of stored energy. This was the principle of the thermal battery. His neighbors treated heat as if it were a gas, a transient substance that disappeared the instant the flame died. Andrew understood that heat could be managed like water. If you poured it into a sufficiently dense material, it would remain there. He concluded that their problem was not a shortage of wood. It was the absence of any means to store the energy that wood released. They were attempting to carry water in a sieve. Andrew was constructing a bucket. He knew that if he could harness the intense, short-lived violence of a fire and trap it within a dense mass of stone and earth, he could stretch the warmth of a single hour into a full night of comfort. His neighbor saw a boy amusing himself with rocks. Andrew saw a capacitor charging. Andrew commenced his scavenging expeditions at dawn, moving with a peculiar, deliberate selectivity that mystified onlookers. The valley was strewn with stone, plentiful heaps of sandstone and limestone that the settlers utilized for their foundations. It was soft, simple to shape, and conveniently close. Yet Andrew walked right past it. He trekked 2 miles farther to the base of the scree slopes, where the dark, jagged spine of the mountains met the valley floor. He was hunting for basalt and granite. To his neighbors, one rock was the same as any other. To Andrew, the distinction between sandstone and basalt was akin to the difference between a paper cup and a steel vault. The physics boils down to density and specific heat capacity. Sandstone is a sedimentary rock. It is comparatively porous, filled with microscopic air pockets. While it serves as a decent insulator, it makes for a terrible battery. It lacks the mass required to hold energy. Andrew needed density. He sought stone that had been forged under the immense pressure of the Earth's mantle. Basalt is volcanic. It is compact, heavy, and incredibly dense. When you heat a piece of basalt, you are energizing a tightly packed lattice of molecules that will retain that vibration for hours. Andrew was not searching for building material. He was searching for thermal mass. He hauled these heavy, dark stones back to his cabin on a sled, his breath coming in ragged bursts, ignoring the lighter, more accessible stones that lay right at his feet. Then he turned to the mud. If the stones were the battery's cells, the mud was the casing that would bind them into a single, monolithic unit. The neighbors watched in dismay as he started mixing a slurry in a pit outside his cabin. It appeared as though he were converting his home into a bog. They warned him about the dangers of moisture. They told him that introducing wet earth into a wooden structure in the dead of winter was a surefire recipe for rot and pneumonia. They saw dirt. Andrew saw cob. He was not merely shoveling muck. He was engineering a precise composite material. His mixture adhered to a strict formula: clay to serve as the binder, the adhesive that held the matrix together; sharp sand to act as the aggregate, providing compressive strength to prevent the structure from sagging; and long-stemmed straw to provide tensile strength, functioning like the rebar in modern concrete to prevent cracking as the mass expanded and contracted with heat. When this concoction dries, it does not behave like dirt. It cures into a rock-hard, ceramic-like material, capable of absorbing immense amounts of thermal energy without deteriorating. It establishes a continuous thermal bridge, guaranteeing that heat moves from the stone to the surface without encountering insulating air gaps. But the most crucial element of his material selection was the one that appeared most contradictory. While he constructed the bench from the heaviest, densest materials he could find, he built the core of the stove, the heat riser, out of the lightest. He gathered fire bricks and mixed them with light, airy ash. This is where his neighbors, and most contemporary builders, misunderstand the physics. They conflate insulation with thermal mass. They assume that because stone holds heat, the entire stove should be fashioned from it. But Andrew grasped the distinction. The engine's core, where the fire burns, must be an insulator. It needs to repel heat, confining the energy within the firebox to drive the temperature up to 1,000 degrees. Had he built the firebox from heavy basalt, the stone would have drawn the heat out of the fire too rapidly, cooling the reaction and stifling the draft. He required the core to be light and airy to generate the heat, and the bench to be heavy and dense to store it. The neighbors saw a boy playing in the mud. Andrew was meticulously assembling a system of thermal checks and balances. Andrew sat on the dirt floor, his hands coated in the gray dust of fire clay, contemplating the strange geometry he had just assembled. To any other builder in the settlement, the configuration was all wrong. A fireplace was meant to be a wide, open maw that could accept large logs. A stove was supposed to be a box. But Andrew had constructed a J. He had built a narrow, vertical feed tube that connected at a right angle to a horizontal burn tunnel. It looked less like a hearth and more like a piece of plumbing. The design was counterintuitive because it utilized gravity in a way that broke with tradition. In a conventional stove, you place the wood flat and the fire burns upward. In Andrew's J-tube, the wood stood upright in the feed and the fire burned sideways, pulled by a draft so powerful it acted like a vacuum. As the wood at the bottom burned away, gravity would naturally draw the fuel down into the heat, creating a self-feeding fire. But the geometry was merely the delivery system. The true secret was in the insulation. Andrew began to pack the space around the fire bricks with the light, fluffy ash he had collected. This was the critical error his neighbors would have made. They would have left the firebox uninsulated to get the heat out more quickly. But Andrew understood that to get the heat out later, he first had to contain it. By insulating the burn tunnel, he was creating an environment where the temperature could soar. He wasn't attempting to warm the room with the flame. He was trying to supercharge the combustion process itself. This leads to the principle of stoichiometric combustion. It is a term that seems more at home in a chemistry lab than a log cabin, but it marks the difference between a fire that warms you and one that suffocates you. Wood does not burn. It is the gas released from wood that burns. When you heat a log to approximately 500 degrees, it emits volatile gases, smoke, methane, and hydrogen. In a standard open fire, the temperature is relatively low and the airflow is sluggish. Consequently, much of this gas escapes unburned. That is precisely what smoke is. Wasted fuel drifting away because the fire was not hot enough to consume it. Andrew's insulated tunnel was engineered to trap that heat until the core temperature surpassed 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, the physics shifts. The smoke does not escape. It ignites. The creosote does not line the chimney. It becomes fuel. This is the state of stoichiometric balance, the mathematically perfect ratio of fuel to oxygen, where every single hydrocarbon molecule is torn apart and converted into pure heat. The neighbors, peering through his window, saw him splitting his wood into small, wrist-thick pieces and shook their heads. They believed in the all-nighter log, a massive round of pine placed in the stove to smolder until morning. But a smoldering log is a dirty, inefficient chemical reaction. It is a pollution factory. It generates a thick, acrid smoke because the fire is starved for air and choking on its own byproducts. It coats the chimney with tar and sends half the potential energy up the flue. Andrew's system was the exact opposite. It was designed for a fast, hot, and clean burn. When he finally struck a match, the neighbors warned him he would burn his cabin down. They filled his head with terrifying stories of chimney fires, where the sticky black creosote inside a flue ignites and transforms a stovepipe into a blowtorch. They did not realize that Andrew had engineered that very danger out of the equation. Because his burn tunnel reached such extreme temperatures, the creosote was consumed instantly within the chamber. It never had a chance to exit the stove as a solid. The visual result was unsettling to behold. In a normal fire, yellow and orange flames lick lazily upward. In Andrew's burn tunnel, the flame was pulled sideways, stretched out horizontally by the force of the draft. It did not resemble a campfire. It looked like a jet engine's afterburner. The fire was nearly transparent, a shimmering ghost of violet and blue, roaring away from the wood rather than dancing upon it. It was a horizontal column of plasma, rushing toward the heat riser, stripping every last calorie of energy from the wood before it could ever reach the chimney. The neighbors saw a boy meddling with dangerous forces. Andrew saw a machine that had finally achieved complete combustion. At the end of that horizontal burn tunnel, Andrew erected a tower. To the neighbors, peering through the frost-coated glass, it appeared he was constructing a chimney that led nowhere. He stacked fire bricks into a vertical column that rose about 3 feet into the air, entirely separate from the roof or ceiling. It stood as a solitary pillar in the cabin's center. This was the heat riser, and it is the single most vital component in the physics of a rocket mass heater. It is the engine that propels the entire system. Andrew proceeded with great care at this stage. He did not merely stack the bricks, he encased them. He procured a larger metal cylinder, salvaged from an old wash boiler or a trim section of stovepipe, and positioned it around the brick column, leaving a gap of several inches. Into this void, he poured the lightest, fluffiest ash he could find. He was effectively building a thermos. The physics at play here hinges on a principle known as the stack effect, but amplified to an industrial scale. In a standard chimney, the draft is created by the temperature difference between the smoke and the outside air. Hot air, being less dense than cold air, rises. But as smoke ascends a typical masonry chimney, it makes contact with the cold bricks, loses its heat, becomes denser, and slows down. This results in a lazy, meandering draft that can easily be reversed by a strong gust of wind. Andrew was engineering a thermosiphon. By heavily insulating the heat riser, he guaranteed that the gases inside would remain at that crucial 1,000-degree mark all the way to the top. Because the gas within the riser is so incredibly hot compared to the room's air, it becomes almost weightless. It doesn't just rise, it rockets upward. This creates a powerful, low-pressure zone at the riser's base, a vacuum that pulls new air into the feed tube with violent force. This is the origin of the name rocket stove. It is not about the shape, it is about the sound. When Andrew completed the riser and placed the outer shell, a large, inverted metal drum, over the assembly, he created a resonant chamber. When the system is firing correctly, the velocity of the air rushing through it produces a low, guttural roar. It sounds as if a freight train is idling in your living room. That sound is the audible frequency of high-efficiency fluid dynamics. It is the sound of air moving so rapidly that it generates a localized weather system inside the stove. The metal drum also served a secondary function. It was the first gear in the transmission of heat. The superheated gases would shoot up the insulated riser, strike the top of the metal drum, and be compelled to reverse direction. This is where the magic of the downdraft occurs. The gas, now slightly cooler after impacting the metal lid, is pushed down the sides of the barrel by the fresh, hot gas ascending behind it. The metal drum becomes scorching hot, instantly radiating that high-grade heat into the room. This is the quick heat. It is what warms you when you first step in from a blizzard. But Andrew knew that if he simply allowed the smoke to exit the barrel and vent out a window, he would still be squandering energy. The gas at the bottom of the barrel was still 600 degrees. In a normal stove, that heat is waste. In Andrew's machine, that heat was the raw material for the next stage. But before he built the rest, he had to test the engine. The cabin was silent. The firebox was cold. Andrew lit a small piece of paper and held it near the feed tube's opening. In a normal stove, the smoke would have drifted up into his face. But here, the flame snapped sideways. It was yanked horizontally into the tunnel, disappeared around the elbow, and a moment later, a faint, hollow whoosh echoed from the barrel. The draw was established. The engine was hungry. The physics worked. The neighbors assumed he was done when the metal drum was in place. To them, a stove was a box for holding fire, and he had constructed one. But for Andrew, the barrel was merely the intake valve. The real machine was what followed. He connected a standard stovepipe to the bottom of the exhaust drum, but instead of routing it up through the roof, he turned it 90 degrees. He laid the pipe directly on the floor, arranging it in a long, serpentine loop that extended almost the entire length of the cabin. Then came the phase of labor that solidified his reputation as the town lunatic. Andrew took his pile of basalt stones and his slurry of clay and straw, and he began to bury the pipe. He did not just cover it, he entombed it. He constructed a solid, monolithic bench, 3 feet high and 4 feet wide, encasing the 20-foot run of ductwork within tons of dense, wet earth. He was building a radiator that one could sleep on. This structure was the horizontal battery, and it solved the greatest inefficiency of the open fire. In a conventional home, the chimney is a thief. To maintain a working draft in a standard fireplace, the smoke must remain hot. If it cools too much, it sinks, and the smoke backs up into the room. Therefore, you are forced to send 600 degrees of heat out of your house just to keep the physics operational. You are paying a heat tax to the atmosphere to maintain airflow. Andrew's system cheated this tax. Because the rocket engine in the riser generated such a violent, high-pressure push, he did not need a hot chimney to create a draft. The engine forced the smoke through the horizontal pipes whether the smoke wanted to go or not. This enabled him to do something forbidden in traditional masonry. He could rob the smoke of all its heat. As the exhaust gases journeyed through that 20-foot tunnel buried in the stone, they were compelled to surrender their energy. The heat transferred from the smoke to the metal pipe, then to the dense basalt, and finally into the clay. It was a harvest. Every foot of pipe served as a collection point, stripping the thermal energy from the gas and depositing it into the bank of the bench. The proof of this efficiency was found at the very end of the line. Where the pipe finally exited the cabin wall to vent outside, the temperature was shocking, not because it was hot, but because it was not. In a neighbor's house, touching the stovepipe would instantly sear your skin. At Andrew's exhaust port, the pipe was barely lukewarm, hovering around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. You could hold your hand over the chimney cap and feel nothing more than a gentle, moist exhalation of air. The missing 500 degrees had not vanished. They were trapped inside the bench. This massive structure acted as a thermal capacitor. Just as an electrical capacitor stores voltage, the 3-ton mass of stone and mud stored heat. It introduced a time delay to the energy. A cast iron stove is a conductor. It heats up instantly and cools down instantly. The cob bench was a storage vessel. It would require hours of firing to saturate that much mass with heat. It was slow, stubborn, and heavy. But once it was charged, once those tons of stone reached saturation, they became an unstoppable force of radiant energy. They would continue to release heat for days, long after the fire had been extinguished. When Andrew finally stepped back, wiping the mud from his hands, the cabin looked different. It felt smaller, dominated by this strange, hulking piece of earthen furniture that curved through the room like a geological formation. It did not resemble a heating system. It looked like a landslide that had been sculpted into a sofa. The community's skepticism reached its peak. They would walk by and peer in, shaking their heads at the damp, gray monstrosity consuming half his living space. They saw a pile of wet dirt that would freeze solid as soon as the temperature dropped, transforming his home into an icebox. They laughed at the boy who had carried rocks to build a monument to mud. But Andrew looked at the bench and did not see dirt. He saw a fully charged battery, waiting for the switch to be flipped. He saw a thermal flywheel that, once spinning, would carry him through the silence of the winter nights, when everyone else was waking up to feed a dying flame. The machine was built. Now, it had to run. The first true trial arrived with the November darkness. The sky turned the color of slate, and the wind escalated from a mere nuisance to a genuine threat. The outside temperature began to plummet, dropping 10 degrees in an hour. In any other cabin, this was the cue to load the stove until the iron glowed cherry red. It was the signal for panic. Andrew did not panic. He walked to his woodpile, which was comically small by local standards, and picked up a bundle of fuel. It was not split logs. It was a handful of wrist-thick branches, the kind of debris his neighbors would burn just to get a real fire started. He fed them vertically into the J-tube. He dropped a lit match onto a piece of paper at the bottom. The draft engaged instantly, a low, sucking thump as the airflow reversed, and the roar began. But this is where the physics of the rocket mass heater tests the builder's faith. With a cast iron stove, you feel the heat within minutes. The metal radiates energy almost immediately because it has no mass to hold it back. It is a direct transaction. Burn wood, get heat. But as Andrew stood there, listening to the freight train rumble of the riser, the room stayed cold. The metal barrel grew hot, certainly, but the massive stone bench, the object that occupied half his living room, remained stubborn and cool. This is the phenomenon of thermal lag, and it is the mechanism that distinguishes a primitive shelter from an engineered home. Heat moves through dense material at a specific, calculable rate. Through dense cob and basalt, a heat wave travels at approximately 1 inch per hour. Andrew had buried the exhaust pipe deep within the bench. He was not heating the air, he was heating the core of the stone. He was sending a pulse of energy into the center of the mass, and now he had to wait for it to migrate to the surface. For 3 hours he fed the fire, consuming his small pile of twigs. To an observer, it would have seemed like a failure. He was burning fuel, yet the room was not warming up. But Andrew knew he was not wasting heat. He was investing it. He was charging the battery. The stone was drinking the energy, drawing it from the exhaust and storing it in the lattice of the rock. Then, the fire went out. He stopped feeding it. The roar subsided into silence. And that is when the heat arrived. It began as a gentle warmth emanating from the mud plaster. It was not the sharp, scorching heat of a fire that singes your face while your back freezes. It was a soft, pervasive presence. The bench, now saturated with the energy of the past 3 hours, began to off-gas warmth. This is the flywheel effect. Just as a heavy mechanical flywheel requires significant energy to get spinning, but continues to rotate long after the engine is cut, a thermal mass takes hours to heat up, but continues to radiate for nearly a day. Andrew watched the window frost over as the temperature outside hit 0. Inside, the thermometer on the wall began to climb. It did not spike. It crept upward with the unstoppable momentum of a glacier. The bench had transformed into a radiator with a surface area of 50 square feet, gently warming the air, the walls, and the furniture. The visual contrast was stark. His neighbors were currently dragging massive logs through the snow, struggling to keep their fires roaring against the draft. Andrew had burned a bundle of sticks that would not have lasted 10 minutes in an open hearth. In his system, thanks to complete combustion and thermal storage, that same amount of wood provided heat for the entire night. The cabin was silent. There was no crackle of timber, no shifting of logs, no roar of the draft. The fire was dead, but the heat was alive. It was a strange, modern sensation in a primitive world, the feeling of being warm without seeing a flame. Andrew lay down on the bench, directly above the exhaust path. The mud was warm to the touch, like a stone that had been baking in the July sun all afternoon. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind howl against the logs, protected by a heat that had been generated hours ago, stored in the earth, and released precisely when he needed it. The lag was not a flaw. It was the entire point. The theoretical phase was complete. The blizzard that slammed into the basin in early January did not just bring snow. It brought a pressure system so dense and cold that the old-timers swore the very air had turned to glass. The mercury did not just drop. It collapsed, bottoming out at 30 degrees below zero and refusing to move for weeks. The wind chill tore through the chinking of the log cabins, relentlessly searching for any weakness in their thermal envelopes. For the settlement, the killer winter had arrived, and it was demanding payment in calories. For the neighbors, life contracted into a miserable 2-hour cycle of panic and exhaustion. They were victims of the sawtooth temperature curve. They would stoke their cast iron stoves until the metal glowed red, pushing the indoor temperature up to 70 degrees. But the moment they ceased feeding the fire to sleep, the heat would vanish. The uninsulated iron stopped radiating instantly, and the drafts, powered by that same aggressive chimney effect, sucked sub-zero air in through the floorboards. Within 90 minutes, their cabins would plunge back to freezing. Rinds of ice formed on their water buckets inside the kitchen. They were sleep-deprived, waking up shivering 4 times a night to restart the fire, trapped in a losing battle against thermodynamics. Andrew's routine was alien by comparison. He woke at 7 a.m., not because he was cold, but because he was well rested. The cabin air was 68 degrees. The bench, that massive 3-ton battery of mud and stone, was still emanating a steady, palpable warmth from the fire he had lit the previous evening. He would walk to the stove, load his small bundle of scavenged branches into the J-tube, and light it. For 2 hours, the rocket engine would roar, driving the temperature of the stone mass back to its peak saturation. By 9 a.m., he let the fire die. For the next 22 hours, the stove was cold, but the house was hot. This strange inversion of reality was due to the physics of radiant heat versus convective heat. The neighbors were relying on convection. Their stoves heated the air. But hot air is buoyant. It rises. In a convective home, the ceiling is 80 degrees, while the floor is 40. Your head sweats while your feet are numb. Furthermore, air is a terrible carrier of energy. It holds very little heat and escapes through the smallest crack. Andrew was living inside a radiant environment. The cob bench, heated to a surface temperature of about 100 degrees, acted like a miniature sun. It emitted infrared radiation. This energy is indifferent to air temperature. It travels through space as a wave until it strikes a solid object, a wall, a chair, or a human body. When Andrew sat in his cabin, he was not being warmed by hot air blowing on him. He was being warmed by energy radiating from the room's core, soaking into his skin and clothes. This created the t-shirt moment that defied the era. While men half a mile away wore wool coats inside their own kitchens, Andrew sat on his mud bench in a thin cotton shirt reading a book. The sensation was unique. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a fireplace that leaves your throat parched. It was a heavy, enveloping warmth, similar to the feeling of lying on a sun-heated rock after sunset. The air remained cool and fresh because he was not incinerating it, but the mean radiant temperature, the average temperature of the surfaces around him, was high. The psychological impact of this efficiency was profound. The town was in survival mode, a state of high adrenaline anxiety where every stick of wood was counted and every drop in temperature was a threat. Andrew was bored. The efficiency of the rocket mass heater had removed the drama from winter. He had engineered the crisis out of his life. He looked at his woodpile, a stack of fuel that was supposed to last a week, and realized he had barely made a dent in it. He was rationing twigs while his neighbors burned forests. He was sleeping 8 hours a night while they woke to feed an iron beast. He was safe, not because he was stronger, but because he had aligned himself with the laws of physics rather than fighting them. The storm finally broke on a Tuesday morning. The wind, which had been screaming across the basin for weeks, subsided to a whisper, leaving a silence that felt heavy and ominous. 3 men from the nearest homestead strapped on snowshoes and began the trek to Andrew's cabin. They brought a sled with them. They did not bring it to haul supplies. They brought it because they expected to haul a body. They had not seen smoke rising from Andrew's chimney in 48 hours. In the brutal calculus of the frontier, this equation had only one solution. No smoke meant no fire. No fire, in 30 below weather, meant death. They moved grimly through the drifts, their own breath freezing in their beards, dreading what they would find inside that drafty shack. They reached the door, sealed shut by a rim of ice. The lead man, a seasoned logger named Thomas, kicked the ice loose and shoved the door open, bracing for the smell of freezing decay or the bite of dead air. They did not find death. They hit a wall. It was invisible, but it was physical. A wave of thick, heavy warmth rolled out of the open door, colliding with the frigid winter air and creating an instant cloud of steam. Thomas actually staggered back, his glasses immediately fogging over white. The temperature differential was so violent, it felt like opening a blast furnace. They stepped inside, stomping snow from their boots, blinking in the sudden humidity. The cabin was not just survivable, it was tropical. It was 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The confusion that washed over the men was immediate and total. They looked at the stove. It was cold. The iron barrel was dark. The firebox was empty. There was no roar of the draft, no crackle of timber, no orange glow illuminating the room. By every law of survival they knew, this room should have been a meat locker. "Where's the fire?" Thomas asked, stripping off his heavy bear hide coat as sweat already prickled his forehead. "We thought you were dead. We haven't seen smoke in days." Andrew was sitting at his small table, whittling a piece of pine, looking bored. He gestured casually to the massive, mud-caked mound that dominated the room's center. "The fire is in the bench," he said. "Or at least, the ghost of it is." The men approached the strange earthen furniture cautiously. They removed their thick leather gloves and laid their bare hands on the rough, gray plaster. It was hot. It was not the searing, dangerous heat of cast iron that blisters the skin. It was a deep, resonant warmth, like a large animal sleeping in the sun. It felt alive. Andrew stood and explained the concept that shattered their understanding of time and energy. He told them that the heat they were feeling right now, the warmth making them sweat in January, was generated by a fire that had burned yesterday morning. He explained that while they were slaves to the present moment, constantly feeding their stoves to replace lost heat, he had built a time machine. The 3 tons of stone and cob acted as a thermal battery, capturing the intense energy of a 2-hour burn and stretching it across 24 hours. He was not heating the air, he was heating the geology of his home. But the moment that truly shifted the power dynamic was not the lecture on thermodynamics, it was the data. Andrew walked them to a corner of the room and pointed to his wood pile. The men stared. It was a pile of sticks. It was mostly brush, thumb-thick branches, and scrap lumber, the kind of debris they usually burned just to get their real logs to catch. "Is that the kindling?" Thomas asked. "That's the fuel for February," Andrew replied. He took them to the window and pointed to his main woodshed outside. The snow around it was unbroken. He had not touched his primary cord of wood in a month. The neighbors performed the mental math instantly. In the last 3 weeks, they had burned through cords of hardwood, exhausting themselves chopping and hauling in the blizzard, fighting a losing battle to keep their families from freezing. Andrew had survived the killer month on what amounted to yard waste. The realization struck them harder than the cold. They had called him the mud dauber. They had laughed at his dirt pile. But as they stood there, sweating in his t-shirt weather living room while the wind picked up outside, the laughter died. They were not looking at a crazy boy anymore. They were looking at the only engineer in the valley who understood that smoke is not a sign of life. Smoke is unburnt fuel. Smoke is failure. The lack of smoke from Andrew's chimney was not proof of death. It was proof of perfect efficiency. They no longer asked him why he built it. They asked him how. The innovation did not stay confined behind Andrew's door. By the next winter, the settlement's architecture had quietly transformed. You did not see perfect J-tubes in every cabin. The learning curve for the combustion core was steep, and the fear of the new dies hard. But you saw the principle of mass take hold. Men who had previously mocked the mud pile began stacking heavy river stones around their cast iron stoves. They stopped entrusting their survival to the thin, fleeting air and started trusting mass. They learned, through the brutal empiricism of the frost, that a heavy house is a warm house. Yet a tragedy followed this triumph. This knowledge, the engineering of the rocket mass heater and the thermal battery, nearly vanished from collective consciousness. It was not lost because it failed. It was lost because it was too efficient to be profitable, and eventually it was rendered obsolete by the arrival of cheap, liquid energy. When the 20th century ushered in the era of abundant oil and coal, humanity stopped thinking about physics. We stopped building homes that harvested energy and started building disposable, low-mass boxes that required constant, expensive inputs to remain habitable. We built houses that were essentially tents of wood and glass, relying on the brute force of cheap gas to keep them livable. We traded the elegance of the thermal flywheel for the convenience of the thermostat. We forgot that the most sophisticated heating system is not the one that burns the most fuel. It is the one that wastes the least. Consider the system's durability. Critics today still look at Cobb and see dirt. They assume it is temporary, destined to crumble back to the floor. But Andrew's bench did not degrade. The constant cycling of heat, the expansion and contraction, did not crack the structure. It annealed it. The clay, sand, and straw baked into a composite as hard as concrete, but with enough flexibility to survive decades of thermal stress. It became a ceramic monument to efficiency, growing stronger with every fire. This is the reflection this pragmatic guide must leave you with. We often look back at the frontier with pity, imagining our ancestors freezing in the dark, awaiting our invention of electricity. But in terms of thermodynamics, Andrew was living in the future. He understood a house should not be a shelter that fights the weather. It should be a machine that processes it. Today, we see these same principles re-emerging in high-end passive solar homes and industrial thermal storage systems. We call it cutting-edge green technology. Andrew just called it staying warm. The physics has not changed. The wisdom has not changed. We just forgot how to read the equation. So, what is the core lesson here? It is that heat is a currency. Most of us spend it as soon as we earn it, blowing it out the chimney or letting it leak through the walls in a panic of convection. That is the path of energy poverty. The engineer invests it. He deposits it into a battery, be it stone, water, or mud, and lives off the interest for the rest of the night. Andrew achieved the alchemist's dream. He turned wood into liquid fire. He took the chaotic, vertical energy of combustion and tamed it into a fluid stream. He made a flame burn sideways, defying gravity, and he turned smoke into heat, defying waste. While history books might focus on the men who conquered the West with gunpowder and grit, the real victory belonged to the boy who conquered winter with mud and math. Imagine Andrew sleeping soundly on his warm mud bench as the wind howls outside, protected not by luck, but by physics. Tonight, when you hear your furnace kick on, ask yourself, are you heating your home, or are you just heating the air inside it? The difference might just be a pile of stones. If you found this deep dive valuable, give this video a like and hit that subscribe button.